Out in the dust-blown silence of the frontier, there are stories whispered around campfires that never made it into books. Stories that hold more weight than bullets and more truth than law. This is one of them. It begins not with gunfire or vengeance, but with a man standing alone beside the smoldering ruins of his barn, his life's work reduced to ash by hands he had once trusted. And yet, as the embers glowed and the smoke curled toward the heavens, he did something no one expected. He broke his last loaf of bread and offered it to the very man who set the fire. In the Old West, where justice was often measured by blood and pride was worth more than gold, mercy was a language few dared to speak. But this man, quiet, weathered, and without a single bullet left to fire, chose to answer hatred with kindness. And that choice would ripple far beyond his little patch of scorched earth. The act seemed foolish, almost maddening, to those who watched from afar. Why help a traitor? Why offer bread to the enemy when your own hands are empty? What no one knew was that this gesture would change everything. Because come sunrise, just as the prairie mist lifted and the crows circled overhead, an unthinkable sight unfolded on the horizon. Dozens of silhouettes emerged from the tree line, not with torches, but with timber, not with war cries, but with hammers and rope. The same tribe that had once burned his barn to the ground had returned. But this time, they came not to destroy, they came to rebuild. What happened next would shake the foundation of two rival communities and echo through generations as proof that sometimes strength is not shown in revenge, but in restraint. In this land of outlaws and honor, where men lived and died by the gun, this one man's unexpected kindness became a legend whispered wherever broken men dare to hope. And now, you're about to witness it all. A tale of fire, forgiveness, and the sunrise that turned enemies into builders. Stay with me, because by the time we reach the end, you may never see the Old West, or mercy, the same way again. The man's name was Elias Boone, a rancher with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too many winters. He didn't speak much, not out of pride, but because life had taught him that silence kept you alive longer than loud opinions ever could. His land stretched across the valley near Dead Horse Creek, a patch of stubborn soil that only yielded to those who gave it everything they had. Elias had given it all. His youth, his sweat, and the love he once shared with a woman who passed too soon. The barn was the last piece of her dream, and now it was ash. That night, when the flames died down and neighbors gathered around the wreckage, some shook their heads in pity, others in anger. They whispered names, accusing the Painted Rock tribe, who had long been at odds with the settlers since a forgotten treaty had crumbled. No proof was needed. Fear made enemies quickly, and in the Old West, justice didn't wait for evidence. One man, however, didn't whisper. He stared at Elias, trembling, soot-stained and hollow-eyed. His name was Tahoma, a brave from Painted Rock, and the one who had struck the match. Elias saw it in his eyes, guilt so heavy it made the man's shoulders curve forward like a beaten dog. But Elias didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't shout or curse. Instead, he walked to what remained of his cabin, tore a piece of dry bread from the last of his stores, and handed it to Tahoma. There was no ceremony, just one broken man feeding another. The silence between them spoke louder than any threat. Neighbors called Elias mad, said he'd gone soft in the head, grieving himself into foolishness. Some even accused him of betrayal, feeding the enemy while their own homes could be next. But Elias never defended his actions. He simply rebuilt his fire pit and waited out the night, alone beneath the stars. He didn't expect anything to come of it. He wasn't planting a seed of forgiveness, just honoring something older than revenge, decency. And yet, something shifted in that moment. Not in the world, but in one man's heart. Tahoma took the bread with trembling hands and vanished into the darkness. But the fire that had burned Boone's barn, it hadn't destroyed everything. It had revealed something buried deep, an ember in Tahoma's soul that had long forgotten how to burn with honor. At dawn, Elias rose as he always did. Not because he had chores, there were none left to do, but because habit doesn't die with hope. He stoked the ashes of a fire too weak to boil water and stood in the doorway of his char barn, now a skeleton of what once was. The wind carried the scent of scorched cedar and sorrow. But just beyond that, there was something else. Hooves. Many of them. Across the ridge came shadows, at first just outlines in the fog. Elias squinted, thinking it might be another settler patrol, or worse, an armed warning. But as the forms grew clearer, his breath caught. It was Tahoma, and behind him were not warriors in war paint, but men bearing logs, tools, and canvas. They were from Painted Rock, and they had come not to finish what had been started, but to undo it. Elias didn't move. He didn't smile, but something in his chest ached, a dull throb where grief had camped out. The lead brave, an elder named Koana, dismounted first. He approached slowly, laying his axe at Elias's feet before uttering the words no man in the West expected to hear from an old enemy. Let us rebuild what shame has burned. There was no apology, just action. And in this land, that meant more. By midday, the clearing that once held only ruin now echoed with hammers and timber being raised. Tahoma worked harder than any man, silent, sweat-drenched, his every swing of the mallet an act of repentance. The others, fathers, sons, brothers, moved with rhythm and reverence. They didn't look Elias in the eyes, not out of shame, but respect. In their culture, a man who shows mercy is never interrupted. The town watched from afar, stunned and unsure. Some rode up to confront Elias, but he waved them off. Let him work, he said. If a man comes to build, don't hand him a shovel to dig his own grave. Few understood it then, but the West wasn't just shaped by pistols and posses. Sometimes, it was shaped by a barn raised in silence by hands once stained with fire. The sun hung high over the valley as the new structure took shape, stronger than the last, built with cedar beams gifted from the Painted Rock forests. Elias didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. He hauled wood beside them, his boots stomping through the soot of yesterday's hate. What mattered was rhythm, the harmony of purpose. And though no treaty was signed, no handshake exchanged, a different kind of agreement formed, one forged by labor, not law. Koana would pause often, watching Elias from the corner of his eye. He saw something rare in the rancher, not weakness, but a strength unfamiliar to warriors trained to equate honor with retaliation. Here was a man who'd been wounded and had not swung back, and in doing so, had disarmed an entire tribe without firing a shot. Koana knew that peace wasn't carved from stone, but built like a barn, one beam at a time, one risk at a time. In the distance, the townspeople watched from their porches, some with arms folded, others with rifles on their laps. Their silence wasn't consent, it was confusion. The West taught them that kindness had a cost, and usually, it was a grave. But Boone's barn stood in defiance of that belief. And as the frame rose, so did questions. Could enemies change? Could hate cool? Or was this just a trap laid with timber and rope? That night, Elias sat alone by the fire pit, sipping weak coffee and staring at the stars. He didn't believe in fairy tales. His wife had died with their child unborn. His brother had vanished in a cattle war, and his land had taken more from him than it ever gave. But what he saw that day stirred something old inside him, a flicker of what men used to call faith. Not the church kind, the kind that believes maybe, just maybe, men don't have to die enemies. Tahoma sat across from him, not asking for forgiveness, not offering any words at all. He only handed Elias a car figurine, small, wooden, and shaped like a hawk. It watches before it strikes, he said, and sometimes it doesn't strike at all. Elias took it in his weathered hands. No thanks, no nod, just understanding. In the Old West, men rarely said what mattered. They just lived it. By the third day, the barn stood tall, finished, polished, and gleaming with sweat and redemption. The final nails were driven in just as dawn cracked over the plains. The men from Painted Rock did not stay for breakfast. They packed their tools, mounted their horses, and left with the same quiet they had arrived. No fanfare, no applause, just the soft thunder of hooves fading into the hills. But their absence didn't erase what had been done. Elias walked through the new structure, touching each beam like a man reading scripture with his fingers. It wasn't just a barn now. It was a story, a monument to the day fire gave way to mercy. And every board held memory of loss, of labor, of something being restored without ever asking to be. It would house horses, grain, and maybe one day, children's laughter again. But more than anything, it would hold the weight of a moment no one else believed in. That morning, Sheriff Dent rode up with 3 other townsmen. Elias met them by the fence. There were no accusations, no drawn guns, just suspicion wearing the face of concern. You sure they're gone? The sheriff asked, eyeing the structure. Elias nodded. Gone and not forgotten. The sheriff chewed his lip. You trust them now? Elias looked back at the barn, then at the horizon. I trust what a man does with his hands more than what he says with his mouth. Word of the rebuild spread beyond the valley. Travelers came just to see the barn and hear the story firsthand. Some believed it, others didn't. But the truth didn't need believers. It stood there every morning, casting a long, proud shadow across Boone's land. The story outgrew the town, became a legend, retold around fire pits, in saloons, and in quiet homes where hope had started to die. And far away, in the Painted Rock lands, Tahoma sat carving another hawk. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if peace would last. But he knew one thing with certainty. The fire had not ended Elias Boone. It had revealed him. And in doing so, it had begun to remake more than just a barn. It had begun to remake them all. Weeks passed, and the barn became more than just a shelter for livestock. It became a gathering place. Men who once kept their distance now lingered near Elias's fences, asking questions without asking. They brought their sons to look, as if hoping the timber might teach them something their fathers never could. No one spoke openly about what had happened, but in the hush of early morning, the town felt different. Less brittle, less armed. But change comes slow to places carved from violence. One night, a group of young ranchers, sons of settlers who had lost kin to Painted Rock, rode out to Elias's land. They weren't there for talk. The flames in their eyes mirrored the ones that had once consumed the barn. But Elias stood on his porch, unarmed. He didn't raise a hand, didn't reach for his shotgun. He just looked them square in the eyes, the wind catching the worn edge of his coat. "What do you think you'll fix with fire?" he asked. Silence. No one answered. Because they didn't come for justice, they came for release. For the ache inside that they thought hate might cure. And seeing Elias, standing in front of the very place they came to burn, untouched and unafraid, it cracked something in them. One by one, they turned their horses and rode back into the dark. No violence, just the slow grind of a new way taking root. The next day, Elias found something strange by the barn doors. 6 fence posts, freshly chopped and stacked neatly. No note, just a gift of work, left by those too proud to say thank you, too shaken to admit they almost repeated history. Elias took the wood, lined his southern fence, and never spoke of it. In the West, not every gesture needed words. Sometimes a man said sorry with splinters in his palms. And far beyond the hills, word reached the ears of other tribes. Painted Rock had done something no one expected. They had rebuilt what they destroyed. Not because they were conquered, but because they were moved. And that made all the difference. Soon, other fires were doused before they began. Not everywhere, not always, but in pockets of the frontier, peace began to whisper between cracks of old grudges. Elias didn't seek fame. He didn't write letters or tell his tale in the saloon. But stories have a way of riding the wind in the Old West. One day, a stranger came, a young man from far out east, carrying a journal and a curious heart. He'd heard of the barn, the mercy, the rebuild, wanted to see it with his own eyes. Elias said little, only showed him around, letting the wood and the silence speak. The young man asked, "Why did you feed him?" Elias paused, resting a hand on the beam nearest the rebuilt stall. "Because someone had to stop the burning." That was all. No speech, no sermon, just the truth, heavy and plain. And that line would later appear in books, in speeches, quoted by men who'd never set foot west of the Missouri. But they never got it quite right. They missed the weight of Elias's voice when he said it, the loss behind his eyes. One summer, Coanna returned. Not with a tribe, not with gifts, just himself, older, slower. He brought seeds from Painted Rock, plants Elias had never seen. "These grow where nothing else does," Coanna said. "Strong roots. Like your story." Elias accepted them, planted them near the barn. By fall, small green shoots broke the dust. And the barn, rebuilt by the hands of enemies, stood watch like a sentinel of new beginnings. There was still tension, still fear beyond the ridges. The West didn't forget quickly. But on that little patch of land near Dead Horse Creek, something sacred had happened. The soil had tasted both ash and grace. And from it, something had grown that neither steel nor fire could touch. Elias Boone never called himself a hero. He wasn't. He was just a man who'd lost everything, and chose, when the moment came, not to lose himself. And that choice, small as it seemed, would echo in the dust long after boots stopped walking across that land. Because in a world of broken treaties and gunpowder justice, A single act of mercy still had the power to rebuild what hate had burned. The barn wasn't just wood and nails anymore. It had become something woven into the identity of the valley. Drifters would pass through and sleep beneath its rafters, drawn by the legend as much as by the shelter. Some left behind small carvings, others coins or letters tucked in the beams. They weren't tributes, they were acknowledgments. Proof that they'd stood in a place where something different had happened. Something that defied the law of the gun. Children played in its shade, unaware of the fire that once reduced it to smoke. To them, it was just a place where horses whinnied and fathers spoke softly about feed and storms. But to the older folk, it was a reminder. Every time the wind howled through the planks, they heard the echo of Elias Boone's decision. A barn built by hands that once hated. A roof raised by those who once sought ruin. It was a kind of magic, rough, weathered, and earned. Even the preacher in town began to change his tone. Once he preached of judgment and vengeance, fire and brimstone. But after the barn, he stood a little longer in silence at the pulpit. He spoke of second chances, of ashes becoming shelter, of enemies laying down their pride. There's more than one kind of resurrection, he said one Sunday. And it doesn't always happen in tombs. Sometimes it happens in timber. But not all hearts were swayed. Some clung to the old ways, sharpening their grief into blades. One night, someone carved a message into the barn door. Never forget who they are. Elias found it at dawn, rough and angry, gouged deep. He didn't sand it down. He didn't replace the door. He left it there, because forgetting wasn't the point. Remembering and still choosing differently, that was the lesson. That was the legacy. In the months that followed, seasons shifted. Crops returned. Livestock grew fat. And the barn never faltered. Stronger than before, not just in build, but in meaning. A symbol of what men were capable of, not at their strongest, but at their most vulnerable. The West had its legends. Gunmen, gold rushes, last stands. But none quite like this. None that began with fire and ended in forgiveness. When winter came, it brought with it a silence only snow can offer. The land lay still, blanketed in frost. But the barn stood firm, its warmth a refuge for every creature that needed it. Coyotes would sometimes huddle near its outer walls. Birds nested in the rafters. And Elias? He spent those nights in the loft, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring at the stars through a gap in the roof beam, one they'd purposely left open. One evening, Tahoma returned once more. His hair was longer, streaked with gray. He brought a small boy, his son. He's never seen the place, he said quietly. Elias didn't respond right away. He simply nodded toward the barn. The boy stepped in, eyes wide with wonder. He didn't see old hatred. He didn't hear the screams of fire. He just saw a structure that stood tall against the wind. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, when a child could inherit peace without first living through the war. Inside, Elias showed the boy the carved hawk. "Your father made this," he said. The boy nodded solemnly, tracing its wings with a fingertip. There was reverence in the way he moved, as if understanding that the object wasn't just wood. It was a bridge. A memory, yes, but also a vow never to return to what had once been. Tahoma watched from the doorway, emotion tightening in his chest. He had burned this place once. Now, his son played in its light. That night, they shared a fire. No whiskey, no tall tales, just quiet. The kind of quiet that speaks more than words ever could. Koana had passed, Tahoma explained, buried under a tree where hawks nested each spring. Elias said little, just stared into the flames, thinking of all the things time took, and the few it gave back. Mercy, it seemed, was one of them, and it was the only thing that ever grew stronger when shared. By morning, the snow had deepened. Tahoma and his son rode off, their tracks disappearing into the white. Elias stood at the edge of the barn, hand resting on the post, as the wind bit through his coat. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a lawman. He was just a man who fed the one who burned his home. And because of that, a barn had been raised, a tribe had been changed, and a boy now knew the sound of peace. Spring arrived late that year. The snow melted slow, feeding the thirsty earth until green returned in cautious patches. Life stirred again, blades of grass pierced the mud, calves found their footing, and birds returned to the rafters of Elias Boone's barn. It had stood through the winter unshaken. But more than that, it had endured through something colder than ice, memory. And now, it bloomed with meaning. The town began to shift too. Slowly, subtly, men who once only spoke with fists now nodded across the general store. A woman from the Painted Rock settlement began selling woven goods at the weekly market. Her presence raised eyebrows at first, but no one stopped her. The memory of the barn, that stubborn, proud silhouette on the horizon, kept tempers tempered. Elias never asked for that, but he welcomed it all the same. One afternoon, a fire broke out on the edge of the valley, dry grass catching flame near Widow March's homestead. It spread fast, hungry, and loud. And before the town could organize a response, riders from Painted Rock had already arrived. Buckets, blankets, even their own livestock to help herd the widow's cattle to safety. No words, no expectation of thanks, just action. It was the barn all over again, but in reverse. This time, they were the first to protect, not repair. Elias stood at the edge of the flames, shoulders squared, watching the two worlds he knew once stood opposed, now standing shoulder to shoulder against something greater. And in the smoke, he saw something he hadn't felt in years: relief. Not because the fire would be stopped, but because the war between men had quieted, even if just a little. They were no longer fighting ghosts. They were fighting for something real. When the flames were finally tamed, and the fields lay smoking but saved, Widow March embraced a Painted Rock woman. No ceremony, no speech. Just arms wrapping around arms. Two mothers who'd once buried sons now holding on to what they still had. Elias turned his gaze back toward the barn, its peak rising above the trees like a silent sentinel. It hadn't just been rebuilt. It had rebuilt them all. Years passed. Time weathered the boards, softened the edges, turned the vibrant red of the barn into a rich, sun-faded amber. Children became men. Enemies became neighbors. And stories became legend. Newcomers would arrive in town asking where the Mercy barn stood. They spoke of it like a shrine, not knowing the man who'd inspired it still lived nearby, still mended his fences each morning with the same quiet resolve. Elias grew slower with the seasons, his hands more brittle, his beard more silver. He spent his days near the barn, sitting on a crate, whittling small pieces of wood into hawks, just like the one Tahoma had once carved. He never sold them. He left them on fence posts, or gave them to passing children, never explaining their meaning. But the children would look into his eyes and feel something. They couldn't name it, but they carried it with them all the same. One day, a group of men from out east, railroad men, dressed in clean boots and cleaner intentions, came offering to buy the land. They praised the barn, said it could be moved, preserved, turned into a museum in the city. Elias listened, let them finish, then stood and walked them to the fence. He pointed to the ridge, to the graves buried there, to the trees planted by Painted Rock hands. You can't move the soil, he said. You can't move what holds it together. They left without paper signed, and the barn remained, right where the fire had taken it, and where forgiveness had raised it again. In time, the land changed, as all land does. But the story never did. It lived in whispers, in glances, in shared work and quiet meals between families whose fathers had once drawn guns on each other. And when Elias Boone passed, on a still, windless morning, the town gathered in silence. Painted Rock came too. Tahoma stood beside the preacher, the hawk Elias had carved in his hands. There were no grand words, just men and women standing beneath the barn he'd once fed an enemy in front of. It was more than shelter now. It was memory made real. A reminder that in a land of dust and blood, one man's mercy could still plant something that even fire could not erase. Some stories don't end with gunfire or revenge. They end with a man handing bread to the one who burned his life down and watching, years later, as that same fire becomes the light that guides two peoples towards something they never imagined: peace. Elias Boone didn't preach mercy. He lived it. And because he did, a barn once reduced to ash became a monument to something far rarer than victory: understanding. We often look at the past through the lens of what was lost: land, lives, pride. But maybe the greatest victories of the Old West weren't carved into tombstones or celebrated in saloons. Maybe they were quiet, like a rebuilt barn standing firm against the wind. Maybe the real strength of a man wasn't how fast he could draw, but how deeply he could forgive. And maybe that kind of strength is what the world still desperately needs today. What would happen if we responded to destruction not with retaliation, but with compassion? If, like Elias, we chose to protect what remains instead of punishing what was lost? His story teaches us that mercy is not weakness. It's the courage to stop the cycle. It's the power to plant something that will outlast fire, hatred, and even time itself. And sometimes, that power begins with something as small as a loaf of bread and a broken silence. So as the dust settles on this tale, ask yourself, what would you have done in Elias Boone's boots? Would you have raised your fists or your hands? Would you have added to the ash or built something that might just stand forever? These aren't questions for cowboys. They're questions for all of us. Because the truth is, every day we're given the choice to build or to burn. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something stirring deep in your chest, don't keep it to yourself. Let others hear it too. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Hit the like button if Elias Boone's mercy inspired you. And share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice matters in keeping this fire of humanity alive. Let's keep building barns, even in a world still full of fire.